Welcome, everybody. Um, every time we have I'm John Haig. I co-direct the Mustafa Rahmani Center for Business and Government. I want to welcome everybody and thank you for coming. I can never quite figure out, is it because our speakers are so compelling or is it because we give you food? Um, but it's certainly nice to see so many people here. I know we have a number of people online, and we really do have a great speaker today. Dan Murphy is the executive director of the center and really a China expert in many ways. And so he's going to do the moderation and the introduction and all of that. But I just wanted to say thank you all for coming.
Thanks, John. As John said, I'm Dan Murphy. I'm executive director of the Mustafa Rahmani Center for Business and Government, and it's really my honor to introduce Dan Rosen today. Dan is the co-founder and head of the China portfolio at the Rhodium Group. And Dan's been observing and analyzing the economy of China and other economies in Asia for over 30 years. I first met him over 10 years ago at the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, where Dan and his group were analyzing Chinese foreign direct investment into the United States and mapping that on top of U.S. congressional districts. So combining both economic knowledge with some political analysis, and I think that's certainly one of Dan's specialties. Those papers were called the New Neighbors reports, and I think they're still coming out. Although the landscape has changed dramatically since those started, perhaps in the 2013, 2014. Dan served in government from 2000 to 2001. He was a senior advisor to the White House's National Economic Council and the National Security Council on International Economics. And I could go over for you the many think tanks with which he's affiliated, the publications he's written, both those that are deeply analytical and for specialist audiences, and those also that are for popular audiences. But you can read all that in his bio. I think perhaps what you wouldn't read is just how well respected he is among the community of people who watch China and the Chinese economy. So whether I'm in China or the United States, when this topic comes up, Dan's name is very often one of those that comes up as somebody to be listened to, whose views are both nuanced and informed not only by economic data, but by deep analysis of politics, both in China and the United States. Dan's going to speak for about 30 minutes or so, and then we're going to open the floor to questions and answers. So have your questions ready. We have a very full room here today, and I think I understand we have a couple hundred or so online. So a great turnout. Please join me in welcoming Dan Rosen.
Let's see, is my mic working here? I think it is. Dan, thank you very much. John, thank you very much. Thank you to the center for inviting me to come up today and share some thoughts with you. It's always a pleasure to come up and do that. This is such a center of excellence for faculty and students and learning and study of what's happening around the area. I'm interested in China and the world, how those things interact. And it's a particularly rich time to be looking at all this. There's a lot happening right now. We have a lot to talk about here today. Let me start by, because this will be, and you can kind of tell by the title, it kind of presents itself as a kind of a fairly bearish, kind of negative take on what's going on right now, right? Although today compared to a year ago, I think most of the conversation, if it's being honest, is like right where I'm starting today, like what to think and do with the fact that China's economy is growing so little compared to what it was in the recent past. So it's not like a shocking statement for me to say things are this weak at present. We'll unpack all that and talk about it. But you know, if we pull the camera back and look at China's performance, its journey in a 50-year time frame, this indeed still remains, even with today's economic headwinds, the sort of greatest economic performance in human history. You could make some superlative statement like that, and I'd rather be debating in favor of that proposition than against it, frankly, on a 50-year time frame. So much to be proud of, so much that the Chinese people, first and foremost, and many Chinese leaders as well, contributed to this extraordinary catch-up of growth over the latter part of the 20th century and into the 21st. China really rewrote the playbook about how to make economic development happen. When I was in graduate school, in the seat that some of you are in today as students here, we were sort of at the end of a different phase of thinking about economic development in transition economies and developing countries that was still more centered on import substitution, capital formation as the singular thing that developing countries needed to concern themselves with, and kind of very much keeping international competition and firms at bay as a sort of unhealthy thing that you had to accept grudgingly. And China really threw that playbook out, opened the doors as wide as they could be opened, permitted and tolerated an extraordinary degree of foreign participation in intrusion, if you will, into all the strategic sectors and other sectors of people's lives in the 1980s and 1990s, to some extent right up until today. And that's really quite extraordinary and should historically be remembered as a great achievement, not just of economic thinking, but of political leadership and thinking, taking the risk to integrate and fuse China's journey with the journey that was taking place in the world in the 1970s and in the 1980s. It's often seen by some Americans just through the lens of competition with the Soviet Union then, and the convenience of forging this partnership with Beijing for these sort of narrow geostrategic purposes. And indeed, that was the sort of catalyst that got things going. But really, most of the heavy lifting and the relationship and the history that followed was economic in nature. It involved civil societies on both sides very profoundly changing their thinking. Fan Shen was like one of the first books I ever read. Turn your body around, your thinking around. It was really a metaphor for how I saw this whole thing that we're talking about. Trying to prove the naysayers wrong, that by embracing foreign participation to this incredible extent, you could achieve better development, faster development than by keeping it at bay. And over those years, the coming collapse of China crowd had to find a new story or find excuses for itself year after year, decade after decade, why that never came to pass. And they ended up looking fairly ridiculous for having predicted a quote unquote collapse so long ago. My own work in 2015, I did a study called Broken Abacus ? Looking at not the GDP growth rate, but the level of GDP, whether the official Chinese series, national income account series on the level, total amount of gross domestic product in a previous year, I think we had a 2013 base years were what we were looking at, whether it was accurate or not. And we found, my colleague and I, that actually was remarkably accurate, that wasn't a Potemkin village economy or whatever there is a Chinese translation for Potemkin village. Some of you will have to Google that because you're too young to remember what that means, but a fake economy, it was not. It was real. And in fact, if anything, it was understated, the official series for GDP in 2013-14. Why? Because the property bubble had been much bigger than they wanted to admit. And if you imputed the rent and counted GDP accordingly, it was actually even bigger, although most of that marginal biggerness belonged to just a small number of upper middle class people, which is the reason why they didn't do that and didn't report that at that time. But all this success that I've just spent the first 5 minutes talking about meant and means that after these decades of extremely fast growth, China has arrived at a middle income level, right? It's no longer on that journey to middle income. It has gotten there. In fact, it got there a decade ago, essentially. The super fast growth, which is our embedded assumption of what to expect from China, was a side effect of being super impoverished at the starting point. In 1978, China's then per capita GDP for taking every man, woman, and child in the country, and I think I'm talking in 2016 dollars here for those of you who know what it means to rebase, was $352 a year. From that point forward to a little more than a decade ago, China's GDP did average 10% a year, double digits, the double digit story. But if, on the other hand, China had started its journey in 1978 at the same per capita income level of Albania, which when I was a kid, we joked about how, or didn't joke, we observed how poor and benighted Albania was within the European story, of $2,000 per capita that year, then its growth over the past 40 years would have been reported at about 4.5%. Not bad, but middling as development economics go over those decades. We'd see China just as another developing country like Brazil, like Albania, like Nicaragua, and on, right? It's only because it was extra impoverished by the mistakes of Maoism and the party through the 60s and 70s that it was able to have such an extraordinary base effect, double-digit catch-up growth rate. So now that we're normal again and we're at middle income, the whole story changes. And everything we think we know about what's a reasonable growth rate for China in the past no longer is the story that we're here to talk about. Even maintaining the kind of middle income growth that we're going to see, I think, is kind of the maximum potential that China can achieve sustainably at this middle income level of, say, 3.5% or 4%, is going to require a completely different set of policy behaviors, skills, institutions, capabilities than the kind of policy performance we've seen the past decade. And so this is going to be really, really hard. In fact, because China has not been able to upgrade its policy practices since 2013, that is why we see China today as effectively growing in a range, say, from -2 to +2%. This is not tomorrow's story. This is pretty much where we are today. I'm going to walk through those numbers and tell you why I think they are more defensible and reasonable set of working assumptions for the China we're dealing with, second largest economy in the world here, so that we can move past kind of holding on to our notion of the China that we all came to love and work with in the, previously, and start thinking about what the implications are. As a development economist, for those of you who want to go down that path, from a national perspective, the United States, European Union, Japan, elsewhere, it's a different set of fundamentals that are shaping the China we will deal with than the set that, for the most part, we're still, working with in our embedded assumptions in our head. So that's where I want to get to, and that all was just a quick introduction. Now I'm going to try to go through the data and the slides pretty quick, because I don't think we should be fixating on the debate about the GDP numbers for very much longer. So it's like the last time I want to explain why China's not growing 5.2% last year, the official numbers. But I can see that we still need to spend a minute on it. So we're going to do that for a sec. And then I'm hopefully the last slide, which is like, and this is how the world looks different in all these different vectors of interaction with China, if I'm right. That's where I mostly want to have the conversation with you, or start a conversation that I hope sticks for you long after I'm gone. I'll keep focusing people's attention on that. Okay, so now what? Let's move to the now what, is I think where we need to be. But so this is China's growth as we think we knew it, right? From 2015 to last year to the present, sort of, right? And what we think we knew was that China was now at sort of a 6 to 7% GDP growth potential growth rate, pattern. And the bars breaking this down here are the four components that are used to describe a nation's total product by expenditures, as opposed to income or different ways to do it, growth counting. And we've got the sum of household consumption growth. So however much household consumption grew, what did that contribute to how big the economy is versus last year? So we're looking at year-on-year contributions to change. If China's a $17 trillion economy this year and it's a $17 trillion economy next year, that's still great news. You still got a $17 trillion pool of output. Pretty amazing. But if it's 17 trillion next year, then it's zero GDP growth. That may or may not be bad news if you're Japan in the 90s and you're managing to go sideways without shrinking. Not bad. If your demographics are shrinking and yet your GDP is not shrinking, maybe that's okay too. We can talk about that. But for a country that's still like $12,000 or $13,000 per capita, you probably need some growth to keep people from, starting a revolution as they did in China in the 1920s and are still going through today because it's an institutional revolutionary party, right? The Communist Party of China. Let's remind ourselves. So we've got household consumption making a contribution to GDP growth. In green, you've got government expenditures, government consuming on behalf of people. For example, by paying teachers' salaries that benefit the household, because people get to send their kids to school without having to pay for private education, theoretically. Likewise, healthcare, those are all government provided consumption for the household that is provided by the state. Maybe building infrastructure as well. And then we've got net exports in red and investment growth, capital formation by businesses, investing money to build assets that keep producing for years to come. So in year one, I spend on steel and wiring and glass for the windows to build a factory to make this podium. And then it makes podiums for the next 30 years. And so I keep having a sustainable contribution to tomorrow's output using today's fixed capital formation in factories and stuff like that. So we're interested in all these different components of what adds to last year's economy and makes it bigger. And the story that we were telling ourselves through the beginning of the pandemic was that things were kind of stable in this way. Net exports, right, which is exporting more than you're importing, simple as that, right, was no longer a driver of China's growth story. Some years it was a little negative, some years it was a little positive, but China was already the biggest trade surplus on planet Earth in human history. And there was no reason to expect that to keep getting even bigger. In fact, as a middle income country, China should start importing more and consuming and letting other people do a little bit more, making socks and underwear for a change, rather than China making everything. That's what the model would generally tell us. Your leader of your center, Larry Summers, did work on regression to the mean 1 decade ago that pointed out that normal should be a slower China. Part of that slowness is, as a consumer economy, it's not exporting as much, let's say, right? Household consumption should be booming for a long time to come. Capital formation by businesses should continue, but be very different. Not as much capital formation in steel factories to build property, more capital formation in higher value added sunrise industries, maybe electric vehicles, right? Maybe sea retention walls to keep Shanghai from going underwater in the next 20 years, which it'll start to because of climate change, if there's not more capital investment in what it takes to adapt and mitigate to global climate change. This is the sadness that we have to deal with, right? And government spending in China, very, very small government consumption relative to in an OECD advanced industrial economy. Government's still saying it would be welfareism for me to spend more on behalf of the people, will make them lazy. You get to the middle income level and government has to provide a lot more services, whether it's mostly human capital investments like in healthcare, education, environmental cleanup, other services, things like that, let's say, right? So the story was that we had come to a new sort of normal of 6 or 7%. Problem is, in these numbers, that most economists, if they're being honest, in the face of deleveraging in 2015 and 2016, China's economy probably slowed to maybe 2% GDP growth. And that's not just a Western view. Among Chinese economists, there's generally a quiet acknowledgement that it was a severe downturn in GDP in those years. So the first problem with our working assumption is that pre-pandemic, 6 or 7 was what we could reasonably expect. Already by 2012, 2013, 2014, that was no longer the case. China was entering a new era, and good policymaking, if it was going to be based on an honest appraisal of the outlook, needed to start stepping down people's expectations about what potential growth really was going to be. Because a lot of reforms, Xi Jinping came in, puts 60 decisions on the table in November 2013, the third plenum meeting that year. All the right stuff is in there. It says, hey, we need to do center-local fiscal reform, which means, exactly as I said, changing government outlays and pushing them more toward things that are supportive of human capital deepening, rather than just allowing state-owned enterprises to make even more steel where there's no demand for it except abroad, which is going to cause political problems for us with our friends and allies around the world down the road if we don't deal with this, right? So even 2013, Xi himself makes very clear that there need to be these profound changes to the policy mix, and any reasonable translation of that into a GDP story, right, would need a pretty significant step down in expectations for what the GDP growth rate was going to be. We didn't see that, however. Then we go into the pandemic years, and of course, everything bounces all over the place. Not normal for 3 years. Nobody knows what normal should look like. And we come to the present moment. What is normal? What should we expect post-pandemic? Coming into 2023 last year, the end of zero COVID is not pretty. It's not the way anybody would set out to do it. Obviously, it was the failure of policy planning rather than an act of intention by Beijing. But it had to be done at the end, and they kind of ripped the Band-Aids off and the cast off the arm pretty much, and just let things kind of let the chips fall where they were going to fall. That was very painful, but the hope was now that that's behind us and we're not going to like drag it out any longer, things will revert to the new normal for growth. And the target put out for the year was around 5%. 15 of 15 CEOs that I would speak to on January 1st, 2023, believed that by the end of the year, growth as we knew it would be back. And their basic assumptions around whatever that GDP meant for their industry would be restored. But there were big, big problems with believing in that story that a few folks were looking at. Even fewer were really publicly putting out there in a significant way. And if you added those numbers up, according to those analyses, it was hard to see how China could do more than about 1 to 3 points of GDP growth in 2023 over what was already a terrible 2022. So this is strategically game-changing. If that is true, then that is outside of the range of what anybody thought was like a reasonable expectation around what would happen in 2023. And what's even more, if you want to argue that that's not just, it's going to take a little longer to get over on COVID, but in fact, it has nothing to do with the COVID years. It's a story that started and a slowdown that started back in 2016. We're just getting to the point where it can no longer be hidden and obscured. And we really are going to reveal a different set of fundamentals going forward that's going to reset people's thinking around what it means to be engaging with China in the world. And here's why that is happening, that 2023 was foreseeable, and it's not just a one-year blip. It is the new normal that we're dealing with here, and it will get even worse if there's not more frank policy out of the center to deal with this. The first, wellspring of getting to potential growth. So whatever your potential growth is, right? You all have the potential to be A+ students. Do you get there or not? What's going to determine that, right? Of course, is like how much coffee you have today and burn that oil tonight to like get ready for that test. But there's other things that aren't done on a one-day basis. It's your habits, healthfulness, jogging in good shape, like your head's clear, you're talking to your therapist, whatever you need to do. It's all between you and your degree. In economics, it's total factor productivity, which flows from all sorts of stuff. Most importantly, in China's case, from 1978 forward, there was all this serious policy reform, all the stuff that I applauded for and celebrated in the first minute of my time at the podium here, right? Things like reducing border tariffs to foreign imports from 40% to 3 or 2, reducing, changing a culture that treated every foreigner as a potential threat to the welfare of the Chinese people, to embracing skilled and less skilled people from all over the world to come into China to be part of the story there from the 1980s, 90s forward. All those things were products of policy reform and more. Many of those policy reformers come through Harvard, lectured, studied here, some of them, right? Been a big part of your community, right? But in the Xi era, from 2013 forward, all the little blue rectangles here are when reforms were started by him, okay, with justification that he explained, made very clear in his gloss on the third plenum in 2013. Things from rationalizing the interbank market, liberalizing the capital account to let Chinese companies go abroad to buy assets, to establish beachfront toeholds to compete in foreign markets, all that kind of good stuff. Center local fiscal reform is my personal favorite, and many others, even increasing the role of independent corporate governance at SOEs, moving the party committee out of the way of deciding who was going to be the CEO. Can you believe that that was what was happening in China like 9 years ago or less? Right through 2015, there was still a lot of talk about SOE corporate governance and right-sizing the role of the party committee versus independent directors. That's the kind of stuff you build a middle income country's future on. So it's not like ancient history here. It's like single digit number of years ago, these things were being done in China with seriousness from the top under President Xi's signature, right? That's how it started. How it's going is the red tickets here. All of those things were suspended. We can talk about why. I've got a foreign affairs article that elaborates some of this from a couple years ago. But essentially, in the process of trying to implement reforms like this, you discover that there's political instability and pushback and risk that comes with doing these things. That liberalizing interest rates means the government and the party, the power structure, no longer has control over the interest rates. You can't liberalize them just some of the time. You have to really handcuff yourself to not being able to micromanage interest rates every time you want one company to win or you want growth to be a little higher. Donald Trump could not control the Federal Reserve. Thank God, right? Just imagine, right, what would have happened. It was bad enough, like with the things he could control, right? How's that for a political statement? So I broke the rule of not being too political, but in any case, I said it. So this policy appetite to get things to a better place, especially because it's middle income level now, and if you don't even get 5 or 6% anymore, which in the old days, maybe it's not 10, but at least it's 5, right? Even without really great policy reform work. But today, without the policy reform work, you don't get 3.5 or 4, you get 0. And that's kind of what we're grappling with right now. Anything much more than 0, you're getting if you're burning the family furniture in the basement to keep the house warm this winter. That's not a sustainable solution to how to power this thing going forward. Throwing a lot of metaphors in, I hope they make sense. So we come into 2023, the official target is we'll get to 5%. Even by China's own data, net exports came down a bit last year, minus 0.7. So to make a 5.2% story as they reported, they need to report that they had this really strong recovery in household consumption, despite the fact that we have massive anecdotal evidence from across the country that while things came back a bit from being locked at home under zero COVID, it was nowhere near the expectations of the households really going on a bender and spending that much. They claim that they have strong investment growth from the uh, 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 business sector, and also that they had strong government spending growth year on year. By my count, my colleagues, 1.5% growth last year, maximum that we could possibly find a story to tell, to say, well, maybe that much, right? The IMF, the OECD, and other major international organizations are essentially accepting this 5.2 story. And I think that's a problem and a disservice to all the folks that need an independent point of view about how the Chinese economy is doing. We can talk about that more. Let me just offer, this is a lightning round here for each of those four components, like why I have a problem with this story that says that all the engines fired, we got what we needed to get our 5% growth numbers last year, which by the way, will probably be the target for this year as well. So we will revisit this critique and this way of looking at whether this stuff is really happening. But if we look at, the variety of available metrics on household consumption, we've got here Alibaba online sales in the dark red, negative territory through most of the year, right? Retail sales here in green, a recovery, a little bit of a bump up over 2022, right? But still, like pretty much below the old average from the good old days. Definitely not a consumer best year in a decade story whatsoever. At best, like a little weaker than the average story over the past 10 years, I would say. The one number that bounces up best is catering, people going out for a meal rather than having it at home. No surprise there. Yes, everybody did for sure go out for a meal in 2023. They didn't get the beef, they got the tofu. As those of you who are looking closely at consumption will be aware, they're downgrading their consumption patterns to be more frugal. Not surprising for reasons that we start to see in this chart over here. This is household credit card debt in blue and mortgage debt in red. What this means is that the Chinese household is massively deleveraging in 2023. It's what you do when you become terrified that you won't be able to cover your debt load and that you could lose your house as a result. What would make people so scared that they would take so much of their marginal consuming power and instead of going out and finally having some fun after 3 years, using it to pay off their mortgage because they're scared their spouse is going to lose their job, because their child coming out of Harvard can't get a job back in China, right? Youth unemployment, right? Numbers that we've all talked about, right? And because what they thought their worth of their life savings is, which is 75, 80% in property, has suddenly been marked down by 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40%, depending on which class of city you're in China, right? But rather than thinking that your property portfolio was worth whatever you thought it was, you're hearing from your neighbors that they just went to sell one of their apartments and the best they could do was 70% of what they thought it was worth. And that's because of the property crisis that's taking place in the country, right? So that's why the deleveraging. And that relates in a powerful way to the consumption story. Business investment. Investment in real estate construction had become perhaps as much as 40 or 45% of all investment in the country. 1/4 of all GDP in the country was tied up with this building out of more and more buildings and malls and all that sort of stuff. And now we look at the change in real estate investment in 2023. This gargantuan collapse. What it took Japan like 13 years to do, China did in 18 months in 2022 and 2023. From 1.7 billion square meters of floor space constructed in 2021 to about 690 million today. 1.7 billion to 690 million. That's the magnitude of the pullback of construction activity in this property bubble economy. And to think that business investment could not be a negative number when 40% of overall investment in the country is shrinking at that rate, it's just insane to think it could be positive. All the electric vehicle investment put together and doubled would not fill that hole up of property sector. As we'll see in a minute, or maybe as you saw on that chart where I had the pre-pandemic and then the 2023 story and the 2024 story, I'm actually bullish on 2024 because I think 2023 was so bad that 2024 could be better. We'll go from terrible shrinkage in property sector to a little bit of positive. And that little bit of positive will be enough to bring the possibility anyway that business investment could be a contributor rather than a subtractor from growth in 2024. Actually, most people think I'm wrong about that so far, that it's still falling more than I expect. I thought I'd see a little more stabilization by now. Land sales have kind of come back to positive a little bit, but actual breaking ground and construction has not. So we'll see whether there's reason to even be a little optimistic about the property investment story here in 2024. The other panel on the right speaks to government consumption, government spending as an engine in the economy. John Maynard Keynes showed us that governments during tough times should have counter-cyclical spending, should stimulate. That's what Biden administration did during COVID, all these giving people checks to go out and, do what they're going to do, saving small businesses, all this kind of stuff, right? That's counter-cyclical spending. The story's a little bit complicated, but the black line here is not, right? The fiscal impulse is all government outlays versus the previous year through 2023 were negative. Toward the end of the year, Beijing increased its budget deficit for the year from 3 to 3.8% of GDP. They announced a 1 trillion yuan special revenue bond, but even those things are not enough to make up for the fact that local governments across the country previously were coming up with the money they needed to pay for everything that the local government does by selling land to property developers. So if property development is collapsing, local governments across the country are insolvent. They can't make their spending obligations. And so on net, fiscal spending is negative last year, not positive. The center is not acknowledging really the seriousness of this and how much we need center local fiscal reform. A decade ago, they were acknowledging it. Now in the latest Article 4, which came out from the IMF a few weeks ago, for those of you who read that kind of stuff, like my friend in the front row, government saying, we've done great tax reform in recent years. That's done. Going forward, the localities can take care of themselves. How on earth, when they're responsible for 80% of healthcare and education spending, these local governments are supposed to take care of themselves? I don't think anybody can offer a really good answer to. The closest I come to that is if they find local state-owned enterprises that they can sell off at auction at a fire sale price right now, given how pessimistic everybody is, they could raise a few $1 trillion perhaps in a short period, like in a year or two, I guess. But that's not going to happen. A little bit of selling things off, but not really a meaningful sale of state assets, I think, is in the cards, not for this year. I think it'll be part of the 5-year story ahead of us because there's not a lot of other options, but we'll see. So finally then, in terms of the expenditure components, we've got net exports. So a little bit frighteningly, if you read closely what authorities in Beijing are saying about how they're going to get their groove back and get back to where they want to be GDP growth wise, they think that electric vehicle sales overseas are going to make a big contribution to China's growth picture. Maybe there's a lot of competitiveness in Chinese electric vehicles, but every major consumer market around the world is currently thinking about putting emergency tariffs to keep them out because it looks like it's dumping of overcapacity Chinese product. That's politically debatable whether that's a fair way to look at Chinese EVs or not. And some of those Chinese EVs are being made by BMW, GM, et cetera, right? So it gets complicated. But I don't think the idea that manufacturing goods exports are going to get China out of this mess, not a reliable assumption right now, given the changing attitudes about trade policy around the world. On top of that, Chinese services trade deficit is going to come back in a big way also. What is a services trade deficit? You are all, those of you who are Chinese nationals in the room are part of it. When you consume education abroad, it means money is being paid to Harvard, presumably, unless you're being covered by an institution back in China or something like that. But even that would be coming to Harvard for your education. And that's a services import to China, even though you're consuming it here, let's say, right? It also, while you're here, if you use an ATM card your parents gave you or you have to pull as much money out of a Chinese account as possible so you can get money out of the country because you're scared about being stuck with all your assets in China, that can also show up as tourism spending abroad, a services import, but really it's capital flight. And traditionally, we thought about half of the services deficit China was running was probably capital flight by people going to Hong Kong, a few other places, Macau, and using that day tourism trip to move more than the permitted $50,000 a year of money out of the country. So not at all clear that net exports is capable of getting China out of the mess it's in. Two more things I want to mention, then we'll get to that last slide that I promised. The first, like two other factors that are not just in the standard expenditure model of what ails the China outlook, but are really important to consider. The first is demographics. China is not the only country having a demographic pullback. People scared of all the things happening in the world, marrying later, having fewer children, but it's pretty much the most acute picture of this that I'm aware of. That green line is population growth on net, which has gone to plus 10 million a year to zero, probably negative today. There's almost a panic taking place in some Chinese circles of creating lotteries to give people having, a baby or getting married like a free car or stuff like this, to try to get this a reversal in this sociological malaise that is tangled up with all these things like tangping that we talk about of, lying flat and bailan or whatever, letting things rot, and all these kind of really dark sociological constructs that people are saying are affecting Chinese thinking these days. The other thing, of course, is geopolitical sentiment toward China. The first 3 decades of the Chinese growth story, everyone bent over backwards to embrace China into the international system. That 1 year that Dan mentioned of me spending at the White House, my job was to get China into the World Trade Organization for Bill Clinton. And I'm proud to say that we succeeded, right? And it was the right thing at the time. And a lot of effort was made around the world to make room for China. The red line here is sentiment toward China across the OECD economies. It is going in the wrong direction if China expects folks to transfer technology, accept its exports, all this kind of stuff, right? So very different story. I'll finish here. I think I've talked much longer than I intended to, right? But so how does this spill over to the world, right? What does all this mean? And I don't have an answer to that yet. I think the old assumptions about all these, and I'll talk through each of these economic interactions between China and the world are no longer sound, right? That trade is getting more and more sort of, normal and natural and market oriented. That's no longer an assumption anybody accepts. I don't know if we can say for sure what the long-term balance in China's trade with the world should be, because I don't think China's current policy design is stable. The stuff that describes how China is interacting with the world economically today will not be the story 3 years from now. It's going to break down one way or the other. It's going to have to be changed, either by design from the leadership in Beijing or because other countries shut the door and cut it off, right? So I don't know exactly what the new normal is going to be in these vectors, but I do know it's not going to be the same as the old normal. And we need to just start thinking about it. We need to start, you guys all need to start teaching it differently. Spending day one of class, like thinking about whether we need to kind of throw out the old textbook, frankly, and then start working toward, what's a reasonable set of working assumptions about where this all takes us. But slower global GDP growth, that's what GDP is, right? That has an impact on debates in advanced countries. I spent 2 weeks ago in Brussels, where my friend here spent most of his career, and the debate has changed entirely. People are thinking about doing radically different things to protect themselves against the spillover effects of slower Chinese growth. If China's not growing, it's not consuming what it produces. And if it doesn't consume what it produces, all that stuff sloshes onto international markets. And just letting it all roll over and knock out industries around the world is not going to happen. Okay, so that's going to change. Increased exports, overcapacity, currency weakness, all this is going to be pushing a lot of Chinese product abroad. If it doesn't go to the OECD, it is going to go to the global South. Whether that's good for the global South and consistent with their interests, not at all clear. It's going to need a whole new set of conversations. Lower inward FDI, that means that Professor Hayes' investments of 3 decades ago or 2 decades ago into China are not happening today. On net, foreign invested enterprises in China are pulling their paid-in capital out of the country for the first time in history, since records have been kept in the 1990s. What does that mean for China? What does that mean for India? Because is that money going to India instead, or some other country? That's there's a lot of interesting questions that have to do with that. Rising OFDI, outbound foreign direct investment from China. Because there's less growth in China, Chinese companies are even more urgently trying to establish bases of operation in Mexico, United States, Hungary to make batteries. We can talk all day about that. Big changes. Stagnant portfolio flows, MSCI inclusion of China, FTSE, all this. There was a great idea about going long China and embracing Chinese portfolio capital in the world. That's all basically being held for the time being at the border. It's not happening, pending clarity about how Beijing intends to manage its exchange rate, capital account, the crisis that could happen if they don't start making some better responses to the policy environment. Eroded influence. Right up until the present day, the IMF is standing by China's 5.2% GDP growth number, as I said. Will China be able to keep the IMF on sides with that for another year, another cycle? Or is the IMF going to start changing how it sees its job in validating or not validating Beijing's preferred set of numbers about how the economy is doing? So that's pretty fascinating. And then there's a bunch of strategic questions that I get asked. Is China more or less likely to mess with Taiwan if it's having all these economic problems at home? I don't know if we want to go there or not today. Dan, let's move to Q&A and discussion. Sorry for talking so long.
No, Dan, that was fascinating. An analytic-driven talk, sobering assessment of China's economy, and I think a call to reconsider much of what we think about Chinese economy and politics. I'm going to ask a question. I already have one question from the audience, but please, here's 2 more. Please signal me to get in the queue. So first question, you somewhat called out the IMF and other international organizations for their numbers on China. Yours are starkly different. Why is that the case?
I mean, it's I've spent a lot of time lately looking at the fine print in the IMF manuals to understand when they put out a WEO number, World Economic Outlook number, and a current estimate for the growth rates of 200 and some odd countries that they track, are they calculating their own independent numbers, or are they forecasting what they think China's numbers are, or are they forecasting what they think Beijing is going to say its number is? And it's really the latter. I mean, implicit in that is that these countries are getting this rating from the fund are using proper system of national accounts, S&A manual methodologies to calculate their GDP growth. And the fund can't go in and second guess and come up with a whole second set of books for every country in the world. And so it has to have some working trust and goodwill and relationships with Chinese authorities. But there can be an asterisk put on that number, and there can be much more forthright discussion in the staff report section. There's already forthright staff report discussion in IMF publications about the medium term. They're acknowledging that within 2 years, China's in the 3s for GDP growth, pretty much in agreement with where I would be in the medium term. But when it comes to today's number, they haven't yet been able to find a basis to challenge what Beijing is saying. Yeah.
All right, and just a reminder to please use the microphone because we have listeners and watchers online. So we have a question here, and then I think in the front, and Mitch, you had a question, and then we'll go over to the gentleman in the black vest.
Thank you. Chris Anstey with Bloomberg News. Dan, I'd like to ask you specifically about the financial sector. You mentioned interest rates in your presentation. Several years ago, it seemed like China was moving towards a Western style financial sector where capital is allocated based on risk reward. We saw the foreign ratings agencies were invited in, foreign underwriters were invited into the bond market. The past 18 months has been starkly different. We've seen a disciplinary initiative in the financial sector that saw even some senior central bank officials caught up. And we saw the establishment last year of 2 new oversight bodies and a whole lot of rhetoric about increasing the role of the party in the financial sector. I wonder, what do you think the consequences and intentions are here?
You know, this kind of, again, if we look at it in a 50-year time frame, I think the intentions have been to make the Chinese financial system more market-oriented, more responsive to a measure of return on investment, right? And more rational, generally speaking. However, it's easier to do that when you're in the stage of growth where almost any capital that's deployed is going to have a good return, because you're so underinvested in things that the country needs and are accretive to growth, like roads and ports and power facilities and steel making capacity and all these things, right? You get to, it's where when you get to the point we're at today, right, where these kind of fairly, kind of basic layers of infrastructure have been built, and maybe built 1.5 times if you look at the overlapping transport infrastructures like airports and high-speed rail that have been built. And you start to see, depending on how you look at it, a decline in marginal return on investment activity. And that is the point at which you have to really start looking hard at what the manual offers in terms of transitioning to a more market-oriented financial system that doesn't just need government approval to build another layer of infrastructure, but needs to be responsive to much more legal intensive, science intensive, consumer intensive business investments that will pay off only if they're really right and really smart. And so the skill set that made for good return on investment in the past is not the one that will guide good financial intermediation going forward. I would say even the United States, and certainly Japan, Korea, European Union, OECD countries, during emergencies can step in and have the center set aside the cold, hard discipline of financial markets to bankrupt people who made bad decisions. Like, we didn't let that happen to the whole US economy in the global financial crisis. But that really is the exception, not the norm. And there has to be a broad belief in the system that that's not going to be typical kind of behavior. Problem is, in China over the past decade, when the sort of old value of government relationship to the financial system no longer was enough to assure good return on the deployment of capital, right? We're always in this mode of thinking now's not the right time to let the market, impose some discipline on the system. And the whole system has kind of become too big to fail. And when that happens, you get this morally hazardous, perverse incentive where instead of a flight to quality, you have a flight to risk. Where, because everybody knows the center can't let provinces fail because they've run up so much debt. Therefore, if the provinces have to pay 12% effectively to issue private bonds to a local government finance vehicle, people are buying it because it's a pretty good bet. It's not going to be permitted to go down in flames as it should. And that's kind of where we are. So there's no elegant way out of this. The US had, I think, 14 financial crises in its history to date. Pretty much everybody who got past middle income point has. China, will have to go through that as well. It'll hurt. There's a future on the other side of it. It'll be China's sovereign decision when's the time when they're going to start dealing with that.
Lucio Vinhas de Souza. I am a fellow here at Harvard, and before I was both at the European Commission and at the European External Action Service, the US Minister of Foreign Affairs. You two share responsibility with the entry of China into the World Trade Organization. I take partial responsibility on the triptych partner, competitor, and rival. And that leads me to my question. What is our optimal policy response in this sort of a scenario? You indicate is unstable. I fundamentally agree with that. So what shall we be doing? Preserving flexibility, or should we have something more structured in terms of our future engagement with the People's Republic going forward?
As I suggested before, I think our old answers to these questions no longer work. We have to acknowledge that. And I think we're in a period now where we can't be sure what the ideal stance toward China is going to be, because we don't know which way China is going to go. There's the China of November 2013, where Xi Jinping put his signature on a fantastic, excellent, very high quality economic reform and modernization program called the 60 Decisions that drew widespread applause and really quite extraordinary. If that is where China is going over the next 5 years, then I think we take one stance toward this. And whatever quarantining ourselves away from the dangers of the Chinese model right now, we do that in a way that doesn't close any doors that we don't have to close. So we lean on the side of maximizing engagement despite all the things that we're concerned about. But we need to decide what is the evidence that China is on that path, that President Xi is now, 10 years later, getting back to his same focus on avoiding the 四路一条, avoiding a blind alley, so that growth potential can be met going forward. Because it's not at all clear to most of us, including to most Chinese economists, if they're being honest, and sometimes we can see them being honest in Chinese publications these days, right? That is what is on track. If China's not on track to that, then I think the likelihood is that there's going to be a lot of destruction of wealth and assets and potential in the Chinese system, and we have to a much greater extent, try to separate ourselves from those risks. I don't think we should be trying to undermine China's outlook. Some very hawkish people, probably including a few in this building, think that China is such a threat to our way of life that if we have a chance to slow them down, we probably should take that chance. I think China's slowing itself down without our help. And we should stay away from taking any responsibility for doing that kind of stuff. It's not necessary. And it's a very dangerous idea to plant in the minds of people that these Chinese economic problems have anything to do with us. Quite the opposite. The West has bent over backwards to promote China's growth and achievements throughout my mere 30 years, but dating back the whole 50 or 55, since Americans in particular, and Europeans too, started going over to try to be helpful, right? So that's the 50-year story of the West and Harvard and the West and China. So anyway, it's a non-answer, or it is an answer, that we need to have a sort of indeterminate position right now. And what's important is that we all define and agree on what are the signposts that we should be looking for that tell us whether we should go a little bit more toward engagement or a little bit more toward avoiding the blast radius, if you will, and trying to watch out for the negative consequences and spillovers.
Hi, Dan. Mitch Presnick, visiting fellow at Fairbanks Center. Terrific presentation. Thanks. It was excellent bottom-up analysis. I was actually surprised that the negative contribution on GDP growth wasn't greater, actually, given at least for property. So that was actually strangely optimistic. My question is on OFDI. Because I think that's a really interesting one. If, it's right out of the Chinese playbook to generate a significant portion of their GDP growth using investment as the model. Now they can't really invest anymore because of diminishing returns domestically, but internationally, I've actually seen a number as high as 1.4 trillion of OFDI estimated through 2028. Have you heard anything in that order of magnitude, or what are your thoughts on what the future might look like for outbound? Thanks.
Well, that would be 5 years of flows, 1.4 trillion divided by 5. We're talking like 150 to 200 billion a year. Yeah, no, those are quite reasonable numbers for outbound direct investment. I mean, over the past 20 years, inbound direct investment was in the neighborhood of 150 to 200. And so a corresponding outbound flow of a similar size seems fit. That seems reasonable.
For 10 or 15 years, the conventional wisdom is that the Chinese economy needs to go towards domestic consumption, less investment, less reliance on export. Do you buy that argument, and is it politically possible?
Well, I completely buy it. If we look at the set of all more advanced economies and look at the role of domestic consumption in their GDP structure, they're all higher than China's, mostly by considerable margins. So, if we're using historical evidence as a starting point for like what should we expect in China, I think that's a pretty good starting point. Is it possible? It's absolutely possible. In fact, it's going to happen. And the reason it's going to happen is that investment growth as we knew it can no longer go on. It has already fallen over. It's collapsed. Okay. And that is the negative property story, not negative enough for Mitch, which that's a great starting point with a good bottle of wine. But that couldn't go on any longer. So by definition, consumption as a share of GDP growth will go up. All that's required for it to be a consumption-led growth story is for investment to collapse. And that's taking care of itself.
Hi, I'm Chen, NPID, a second-year student. So I have a question for you. Is that I think the Chinese, not only the Chinese official statistics are not reliable, but also the Chinese government stopped publish certain indicators such as the unemployment rate. So I think before, like people look at the power generation rate. Also now people look at the volume of the package that's delivering. So I just wonder what indicators are you looking at in your daily work, like to have a sense of what's happening there? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great question. And there's a lot of different sources of information that can be valuable for good economic assessment. Despite the problems with the GDP data, I think the macroeconomic time series data can be very, very valuable. In fact, my 1.5% GDP story is mostly using Chinese data. It's just when you add it all up, it doesn't add up to 5.2. So the aggregate number is not reliable. It's not correct. But much of the component data, I mean, maybe you think that's too optimistic, as some people do, even my 1.5. But there's a lot of value to be found in the data that the National Bureau of Statistics puts together. So don't throw it all out. You have to use it with a lot of care, though. I agree with that. Trade data, export, import data tells us a lot, right? Just as with a human being, the food balance of how much they're consuming tells you something about their health. Likewise, for the Chinese economy, its consumption of soft and hard commodities from around the world tells you a lot. We have satellite imagery that's used for commercial and academic analysis today that can see activity, nighttime lights, gas emissions, cars in parking lots. There's a lot of that. On top of all that, the most important data for Rhodium Group, for my colleagues and I, and probably the reason why I think we've impressed people with our ability to anticipate real growth dynamics over the past 3 or 4 years is credit data. Every day, minute by minute, overnight market, very fast moving credit markets, bankers' acceptances, not just the interest rate that the government sets, but the short-term rate to borrow money on 1-day basis, 1-week basis, this bond, like local commercial paper markets, that's all accurate. That's all real data. And if you know how to read the signs in the movements in demand for money and price for short-term money like that, you can really figure out a lot about what's going on. Likewise, the mortgage and credit card deleveraging slide I showed you for the households, that gives me more confidence that I know how serious the consumption story is than the retail sales data and all that kind of stuff as well. So I encourage you not to be too defeatist about economic analysis from a quantitative perspective. If people say, don't listen to those economists, just listen to me, like in that conversation, and go back to the numbers and figure out how to work with them in an effective way.
All right, it looks like we have time for one more question.
Hi, thank you so much for your time today. My name is Thomas. My question for you is, what role do you see China's continued investments in the clean energy transition playing in its economic growth?
Great question. And I didn't even mention climate once, I don't think, in everything that past hour and 10 minutes, which was a terrible lacuna. So I'm glad you took it where you did there at the end. Look, no question about it. China is the biggest investor and producer of clean tech, green tech, renewable energy, manufacturing capability, and product in the world right now. And so that is, once again, kind of changing the game for what we think is possible in terms of the supply side for creating products we're going to need if we're going to deal with our climate emergency that we're in effectively, right? However, there is a lot of politics mixed up and ideology mixed up with that Chinese green future campaign, so to speak. My colleagues recently looked at the quote unquote green finance bonds. There are a new kind of bond issuance window that has been approved and set up over the past 2 years. And we looked at the proceeds of funds raised through these green finance bonds and came to the conclusion that around 90% of the proceeds were used to do the same brown stuff that was done previously, just under the guise of a green finance bond, for example, right? So I'm both aware of China's potential once something becomes a priority to produce the kind of products that could be decarbonizing that the world will need. And I'm at the same time terribly concerned that if there's not an improvement in transparency and governance and the culture of how policy is made, then things purporting to be the solution could end up just making the problem bigger, of creating legacy product, extending for another 10 years the build out of stuff that nobody needs, whether it's real estate or steel mills or excess capacity in some kinds of vehicles, including electric vehicles, or things that add a mountain of electric scooters that end up just going into landfills, right? So that's another non-answer, I'm afraid. But there's enough to get really excited about. But for that to play the positive role it should be playing, we need to see a different kind of political culture and transparency in how China's doing it.
Dan, just a fabulous presentation, data-driven analysis, a convincing story, a new story. I think the word that I'll walk away, or the words I'll walk away from this talk with, are indeterminate position. I think we all, myself included, are maybe guilty of jumping to conclusions in China on where China is or where China is going. And that thought of of taking that pause and reassessing some of our implicit notions is quite powerful. So please join me in thanking Dan Rosen.